Ladies and gentlemen, we're back today. We've got somebody I'm excited to talk with because he's an author and a journalist and a heck of a nice guy for coming on and talking to me. We've got Adam Hochschild. How you doing?
Good. Good to be with you.
So you've written a lot about, exploitation in Africa, war, politics, things like this. How did you get your start as an author and a journalist, particularly looking at history?
Well, I started off as a daily newspaper reporter a long time ago. Then I worked for magazines for some years, writing magazine pieces. But and then when I was maybe 45 or so, I realized that what I really wanted to do was to write history, and that's pretty much what I've been doing since then. And I think an enormous influence on me was that I came of age in the 1960s when the world seemed on fire. I was very much involved in the movement against the Vietnam War. Proud to say that when I got my FBI files under the Freedom of Information Act, I had more than 100 pages. And I was also briefly a civil rights worker in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. That was the year that 1,000 people from all over the country went there for brief periods of time.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, and good for you. We need anti-war movements stronger and disable the military-industrial complex still. But then what was one of the first eras or time periods that you kind of romanticized and thought, oh, I need to learn everything about this thing?
Well, I'm not sure romanticize is the right word, but my first book that had a lot of history in it was a book called The Mirror at Midnight, which was a book about South Africa. And I had spent considerable time in South Africa as a journalist, done a number of magazine pieces. This was during the apartheid years. And I wanted to find a way of writing about the country that was not just an American journalist goes there, travels around, comes home, describes what he sees. So I decided, this was in the year 1988, that I would structure the book around an episode in South African history that had happened 150 years earlier, the Battle of Blood River, which took place in 1838 and was really the battle that determined whether the Boers or the Zulus would run that part of the world. And it was also at that battle that it became clear that a relatively small number of people with muskets, rifles, could defeat a vastly larger number of people armed just with spears and shields. And that, that battle is celebrated by Afrikaner South Africans, Afrikaans-speaking South Africans, with tremendous fervor. And when the African National Congress went underground in the early 1960s, when the African National Congress went underground in the early 1960s and started blowing up buildings and so on, they picked that day, December 16th, the anniversary of the battle, for some of their first sabotage actions. So I interwove the story of the events leading up to that battle with my travels around apartheid South Africa 150 years later in 1988, which ended up with attending a pageant-like reenactment of the battle put on by a neo-Nazi group on the far right. So that was my way of exploring the history of that particular country, a country which had long fascinated me. And I had many friends who were involved in the movement for justice there.
At some point in your life, you realized that you left-leaned to a degree.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, you don't get an FBI file for nothing, that's for sure. So you wrote a book called King Leopold's Ghost, and this was incredible book because it chronicled some of the horrible things that went on in the Congo on behalf of the Belgians. Is that right?
Well, it was actually before it became the Belgian Congo, which happened in 1908. That territory, same borders as the Democratic Republic of Congo today, that territory was the personal, privately owned possession of King Leopold II of Belgium. He got in early in the scramble of Africa. Belgium, at that time, it was, as it still is, a small country. It had no navy, no merchant marine, and people there considered it an extravagance to have a colony in Africa. And the Belgian government was not interested. Well, this suited Leopold just fine. He was a very ambitious, very greedy man who had become king of Belgium in 1865 at a time when it wasn't so much fun to be a king anymore because you had to share power with elected parliaments. So he wanted a colony where he could rule supreme, wouldn't have to answer to anybody, and where he could make a lot of money. So he hired the British explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, the man who found Livingstone. Stanley worked for Leopold for 5 years, essentially staking out the borders of this vast territory in the center of Africa. And then Leopold bamboozled first the United States and then all the major nations of Europe into recognizing this colony as belonging to him personally. And it did for 23 years.
Gee whiz. I'd like to think we've moved away from that kind of thinking, but I don't know. It's
yeah. There are a lot of strong men out there in the world who want a lot of wealth for themselves.
So, did Belgium ever, pay reparations or ever be formally chastised for what they've done in Africa?
Well, they've certainly been chastised plenty, but formal reparations, no. That King Leopold's private territory became the Belgian Congo in 1908. Then it became independent in 1960 and has had a quite troubled, difficult history ever since then because the Belgians had not in any way prepared for this territory to become self-governing. They had a deliberate policy of not giving higher education to large numbers of Congolese people. So they've had a tough time. And many Congolese have asked that the Belgians should pay reparations or make amends, but so far nothing like that has happened. The only case in Africa where something like that has happened is that Germany has agreed to make a large payment to Namibia, which was once German Southwest Africa, in recognition of the genocide that Germany carried out there before the First World War.
Yeah, is it fair to say that there's an incredible amount of similar stuff happening, but under the guise of international development today?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, exploitation has been with us since the beginning of history, and it still goes on. The tragedy where much of Africa is concerned, and you see it nowhere more clearly than you do in the Congo, is that here is a continent that is immensely rich in natural resources. Congo, for example, has diamonds, gold, tin, manganese, coltan, cobalt. These things are in every cell phone, electronic device that we use. Oil and gas. And all of this stuff the wealth from it is flowing outside the country. It's Western multinationals who build mines and so on. And now the Chinese are very heavily involved there and elsewhere in Africa. Again, just like the European colonialists in the 19th century, they are eager for raw materials. And they make deals where, they get a 50-year lease on a mine or something in return for building a road or a railroad, and I'm sure passing a lot of money under the table to local bigwigs as well.
Yeah, the emphasis of, Africa is where France gets some huge majority of its uranium, and that's already, if that power balance shifts, well, I think the whole world is going to feel it. Your book, To End All Wars, okay, this explores anti-war movement during World War I, and I really think this is fascinating. Can you take me through some of the most kind of interesting characters of this book?
Sure. That's my favorite of my history books.
I like it.
Good. I've long been obsessed by the First World War, and for a couple of reasons. One is that it was so senseless. It didn't have to happen. In 1914, all the major nations of Europe were getting along quite well. None of them openly claimed a piece of anybody else's territory. The royal families of Britain, Germany, and Russia were all closely related, cousins. They visited each other. They went on yachting vacations together. And the Russian and German royal families had a great deal of power, total power in Russia. British royal family, no, but the other two did. And yet this war happened. Each side was convinced they would win it in a matter of weeks. And we know what happened. It went on for 4 terrible years and left absolute devastation in its wake. 9 million soldiers dead, depending on how you count them, an even larger number of civilians. Well, so here's this senseless war. But what has always fascinated me is that there were people who saw at the time that it was going to remake the world for the worse in every conceivable way. And they spoke out against it. And they, made clear that, they were not going to fight, or they were going to, support those who refused to fight. Now, war resistors existed in all of the belligerent countries, but nowhere were they more powerful, numerous, and interesting than in Britain. In part, I think, because Britain itself had not been attacked at the beginning of the war. Germany marched into France and Belgium, but not to Britain. They rather hoped that Britain would stay out of the war. So there was an outspoken anti-war movement in Britain. I tried for the longest time to figure out how I was going to tell this story, because I didn't want to do just a series of portraits of these boneheaded generals who sent their own sons into battle day after day, month after month, year after year, and then a series of portraits of pacifists. And then one day I was reading a quite boringly written scholarly article by an academic about a British woman pacifist named Charlotte Despard, who was a outspoken lefty on every issue, advocated independence for India, independence for Ireland, had gone to jail 3 times in the battle for women's suffrage, traveled up and down England speaking out against the war. And one sentence in this article said, naturally, Mrs. Despard's activities caused consternation to her brother, and it gave his name. And I recognized it. British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front, Sir John French. And I thought, wow, that's going to be an interesting relationship to write about. And then the next day, it dawned on me, I'm going to look for divided families. That's how I'll tell the story. I remembered that during the Vietnam War, many American families had been divided. Well, the same thing was true in Britain, 1914, 1918. So I went looking for other divided families. First, there was this pair, Charlotte Despard, the outspoken pacifist, and her younger brother, British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front, 1914 to mid-1915. They'd been very fond of each other as siblings growing up. And actually stayed in touch during the war. What finally drove them apart was that he was sent to Ireland to suppress the nationalist uprising there. And she went to Ireland after the war and joined the Irish Republican Army. At that point, they stopped speaking to each other. So that was one family I focused in on. Another was the Pankhurst family of suffrage activists, where the mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and one of her daughters, Christabel, dropped all their suffrage activities and became ardent super patriots for the duration of the war, whereas another daughter, Sylvia, became ardently opposed to the war, spoke out against it, published an anti-war newspaper, and so on, stopped speaking to her mother and sister. And then the third family group was a very interesting, brilliant, talented, and somewhat sinister man named Alfred Milner, who was really the second most powerful civilian in England after the Prime Minister, sort of in charge of coordinating the war effort, and a staunch believer in the British Empire. And he had a godson who was in jail as a conscientious objector, and came from a family with a couple of other people in it who felt the same way. So it was through these characters that I tried to tell the story of that era.
But no tie-dye and no long hair, but still anti-war.
Right. The fashions were different then.
Yeah. And you've also talked about early on in the early 20th century, we forget about, what we had to go through as far as fighting for our rights and them killing union workers. Can you talk a little bit about Eugene Debs and these socialist and kind of anarchist characters from the early 20th century?
Sure. I've talked about Debs and other people in my last two books, Rebel Cinderella, which is a story of a remarkable woman who lived through that period, and the most recent book, American Midnight, which is the story of the political repression that took place in the United States, 1917 to 1921. Eugene Debs was a wonderful man. He was many times the socialist candidate for president, won 6% of the vote in the 1912 election, and then he was sent to jail by the administration of President Woodrow Wilson in 1918 for speaking out against the First World War. And many people don't realize just how repressive the United States was during that period. From 1917 to 1921, essentially Wilson's second term, roughly 1,000 Americans went to jail for a year or more, and a much larger number for shorter periods, solely because of things they wrote or said. Not that there wasn't anybody doing anything violent during that time. There were. They went to jail too, but these were political prisoners, people sent to prison simply for the beliefs that they stated. Debs was one of them, and he was still in jail, as were many of these other folks, several years after the war ended. And in November 1920, 2 years after the war ended, he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the socialist ticket. It was the first time someone had run for president in this country from behind bars, but maybe not the last. We'll see.
Could happen. Very, very, very surely could happen. But I also wanted to ask you about your book, Bury the Chains, because you write about abolitionist movement in the British Empire. And I just wanted to know how that might correlate to what Africa's going through now.
Well, the abolitionist movement in the British Empire was a fascinating thing, and it was a much stronger and more influential thing in a way than the abolitionist movement in the United States. Here, it took the Civil War to end slavery, and an enormous number of deaths, a huge amount of suffering. In the British Empire, and there slavery basically meant the British-owned islands in the Caribbean, the end of slavery came about as a combination of two things. One was slave rebellions in the Caribbean, which happened frequently because on every one of those islands, enslaved people outnumbered free people by an enormous margin, 5 to 1, sometimes 10 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. And the slaves understandably felt, there are so many of us, there's so few of them. If we could just rise up and seize the right arms, we could take over. So there kept being these rebellions. And there was a particularly big one in Jamaica in 1931-32, which really helped push Britain towards freeing the slaves. At the same time, there was, over a 50-year span, coming in a number of waves, this remarkable popular grassroots movement in Britain that invented all the tools that we use for political organizing today. The idea of a national organization with its headquarters in the country's capital and chapters in towns and cities around the country. It was the first time something like that had been done. The idea of people of different religious denominations, and that was an incredibly important thing in 18th century Britain, coming together to work together for a secular end. Hadn't happened before. They developed so many things we use today. Theirs was the first logo for a political organization. It showed a kneeling slave in chains, surrounded by a legend, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And then a little later, when women abolitionists got into the act, they created one that showed a woman slave in chains and the legend, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" These folks invented the first political poster, and we've all seen reproductions of it. It's that top-down diagram of a slave ship that shows the bodies of the enslaved passengers, packed in like sardines. And you see it on book covers and record album covers and so on. That was done by a local committee of this anti-slavery group in Britain in 1788. They saw how effective it was. They ran off thousands of them, put them up in pubs all over England. They sent a batch to their friend, fellow abolitionist Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. They sent a batch to another fellow abolitionist, the Marquis de Lafayette in Paris. And this movement was really off and running. It was a remarkable thing.
It's incredible. When in times of injustice, you have to have persistence and tenacity. And if you have that, anything can happen. You could actually make progress in the world sometimes. You also wrote a book called Spain in Our Hearts. It tells a story about Americans who fought in the Spanish Civil War. What made you want to write that? What was that about?
Well, the Spanish Civil War, as I'm sure you know, took place 1936 to 1939 and was really sort of the opening battle of World War II. Spain was a democracy. They just had an election in 1936, early 36, which a coalition of liberal and left-wing parties won. And in response, that summer, a group of right-wing army officers who quickly came under the leadership of General Francisco Franco organized an uprising and tried to take over the country in a coup. There was enormous resistance everywhere, but Hitler and Mussolini immediately began sending aviators, tanks, planes, ships to aid Franco. And pretty quickly, the other side, the government of the Spanish Republic, recruited volunteers from many countries, more than 30,000 of them altogether from some 50 different countries, to fight for them. The international brigades, there were 5 international brigades, and 2,800 Americans were among those who fought in Spain. 750 of them died there, never came home. I had always been interested in that war because in my first newspaper job as a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, 2 other reporters in the newsroom, older guys, like 40 years older than me, had been volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. And when things were slow in the newsroom, I would ask them about their experiences. I'd also read George Orwell's extraordinary book, Homage to Catalonia, one of the great works of 20th century literature, about fighting in Spain himself as a volunteer. And in the 70s and 80s, there were a couple of surviving American volunteers living here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I am, whom I got to know quite well. So I felt I sort of had a personal connection there, but it was also a fascinating political moment to dive into. What made 2,800 Americans go off and fight in somebody else's civil war? So I tried to tell the story of that that experience through the lives of some of these volunteers, of other Americans who were in Spain at that time, journalists in particular. And there's an American villain in the story, the chief executive of Texaco, who broke the law by selling General Franco all his oil that he needed to power this vast military machine of his.
Franco is such an interesting character because he was a horrible, horrible fascist, but he lasted so much longer than the rest of them that it's kind of a shame.
He did. His side won the war in 1939, and he stayed in power until he went senile and died in 1975. So 36 years as a right-wing dictator.
Yeah. And the fellow that overthrew Allende. What was that? What was his name? Pinochet. Oh God. Pinochet. No good. And also Hemingway was in that during that time period in the Spanish Civil War. Happen to be there as well?
Yeah, Hemingway was there as a correspondent. He had become a world-famous writer, perhaps the most famous writer in the world, certainly the English-speaking world at that time. And he was passionately in favor of the Spanish Republic, made 4 trips to Spain during the war, up to several months each, in which he wrote a series of articles that were syndicated in newspapers all over the country. And he took part in one raid behind enemy lines.
Well, the old drunk guy, what are you going to do? Yeah. So one more question. In your book, The Unquiet Ghosts, you explore how Russians remember Stalin. Now, this is very interesting to me. So how does it differ from how we view Stalin?
Well, I think there are a lot of Russians who would view him the same way as we do. Although, of course, in recent years, he's been somewhat glorified by Putin as a strong leader of a strong country that Putin wants to restore the boundaries of that empire. It was something that had always fascinated me because I'd been to Russia a number of times as a journalist to write newspaper and magazine pieces. I'd always been fascinated by how this extraordinary country that gave us people like Tolstoy and Chekhov could also give us Stalin and the Gulag. Just how did that come about? And then, of course, even after Stalin's death, for decades, you couldn't really talk about what happened under his rule. This was a country that really sort of did a self-inflicted genocide on itself. But people couldn't talk about it. You couldn't openly study history, real history in school. People would talk to you over a family dinner table if they trusted you, and would tell me about, an uncle who got shot or a grandfather who got sent to the Gulag or whatever. And I met a few of those survivors. But it wasn't until Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s that began to change. The forbidden books began to be published. People were able to rethink how they taught history in school. They were able to literally dig up mass graves. And I wanted to see what that process was like. So my very tolerant family moved with me to Russia for 6 months. I traveled all over the place, and we were very lucky to get there at the beginning of 1991 which was the very month, January of 1991, where they lifted all the restrictions on where foreigners could travel. Previously, there had been vast areas of the country that were completely off limits, including the areas where the old Gulag camps were, which I wanted to go see. So I traveled to some of them, and several times had the experience of being the first American or Western European that people in a particular town or city had ever seen. Because of their just having lifted these restrictions. And that's not an experience you can have very easily anywhere in the world these days.
Yeah. And Russia is such an interesting country. And obviously, in 1917, you have this very interesting and very kind of romantic kind of proletariat uprising. So when does the whole thing go sour? Or is it a slow process?
I think it was a slow process, but in a way, the first act of that process was January 1918. And the just after Russia had had what was really its first reasonably free election ever, in which the Bolsheviks, the most radical faction, which had seized power in November 17, did not win a majority. They only won about 25%. But that elected legislature met for one day, and then it was broken up by Bolshevik soldiers. They sent everybody home. And the next meaningful election of any kind would not happen for another 70 years or so. So that's kind of when it began. But of course, there was flourishing of a lot of interesting artistic stuff during the 20s. They were sending some people to prison, but not in huge numbers. Then by the time Stalin became, in effect, dictator around 1927, 28, he really had the kind of total control over the country that then was his paranoid side was reflected in that when in the mid-1930s he began sending huge numbers of people to the Gulag or to the execution cellars.
Yeah, and this is typical among authoritarian and unfortunately communist history. So, yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame. It was a good idea. I liked it on paper. It was good. So I want to thank Adam Hochschild, a wonderful human being, nice gentleman, for coming on. He's got all these books. You got to check it out. King Leopold's Ghost, To End All Wars. That might be the favorite. Bury the Chains, Spain in Our Hearts. And I got one more here, The Unquiet Ghost. Anything you want to add before we go?
I don't think so. It was a pleasure talking with you, Chris, and I hope we can again sometime.
I hope so, too. All right. We'll sign off to everybody in TV land. Bye, everybody. See you next time.